Would term limits solve our political woes? Was the bombing of Hiroshima justified? Do parents have the authority to tell teachers what to teach? We take on these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather the cringiest or the best takes from the internet, and we talk about why we like or dislike them. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to follow us on socials, Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube, and Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram. Comment and share if you're watching or listening to this, because it always helps us out a ton. And without further ado, we'll go to our first take. And this comes from an exchange on Tumblr. I think I grabbed it from Twitter or Facebook or something like that, though. And the first person writes, Animal Crossing villagers be like, ugh, I have such a busy day today. And then they sit under a tree and eat a sandwich for 3 hours. And then there's sort of a reply comment to this saying, clearly they are busy resting and nourishing themselves. Capitalism has brainwashed you to think busy means working. And for anyone who's not familiar, Animal Crossing villagers just refers to characters in the video game Animal Crossing. And Animal Crossing is just generally a more relaxing kind of video game, not a lot of busy work, just kind of go at your own pace and laze around. So what do you think about this take? Is busy just a construct of capitalism?
Yes, it is a construct of capitalism, but this is still a really bad take, because what this person's inferring is that, we should be compensated for being busy regardless of whether we produce value. That's kind of the underlying thing that this person's inferring. And the thing is, and you and I were just talking about this right before the show, that like a lot of these video gamers and people that play video games, and you and I both play a lot of video games. Like I was just playing Fallout.
Nice.
You could be really busy in these games. You could complete all these side quests and do all this stuff, but at the end of the day, if that's all you did 24/7 for a week, you would have no food on the table. You'd have created nothing of value. But because of the dopamine rush that you get from this stuff, as we were talking about earlier, like it produces the thought that I have been productive. I have done something, even though you actually haven't. Because in the real world, where you strip all of this modernity away, and you strip all of the infrastructure that's been created, it's like, well, we are actually all, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, we are all cogs in a wheel. We are all members of a team, and we all have to produce something. And if we all are producing just a little bit, that means that we all have an abundance of things. But if people aren't producing things, then yeah, you are going to, everyone that doesn't produce something is actually a net negative on the system because they're consuming more than they produce. And so just because, someone is busy, if you went out and you dug a big old hole for no apparent reason, like you were very busy and you actually expended a lot of energy and you moved a lot of dirt. And maybe if that hole was, towards some sort of treasure, then it would be productive. But if it was just in your big backyard, then that's all you got is a big old hole and a lot of energy and wasted time. And it makes me think of, have you ever watched the show Alone on National Geographic?
I've seen bits and pieces, yeah.
It's an amazing show. Like it's these people that are dropped off out in the wilderness, and it's a competition to see who can survive out in the wilderness alone for as long as they can. And what's crazy about it though is that you realize when people get to their base level living, which is you're dropped in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of supplies that you've got to work with and to make your own way, that food is the number one thing that will make you lose in that game. So if you don't have food, if you don't have calories, you're going to lose. But the problem is that you have to decide when you're going to expend energy, right? So if there's this one guy and he tried to chase down this elk and he expended a ton of energy, right? If you think about running 10 miles in a day, that's what this guy did, trying to chase this thing down and shoot it with a bow and arrow, and he wasn't able to do so. So he expended about 1,200 calories running this elk down, and then he didn't get any reward for it, right? He was very busy, but he wasn't actually able to convert that into value. And so therefore, he had screwed himself because now he expended all his energy, never made anything up, and he wasn't able to, recoup. So he had to call out because basically he was wasting away. So that's what capitalism is. It's to be busy means to be working, and working means generating value or value that is being generated. It's okay to go take a risk on things, but you have to know that there is a risk being taken, that you might not be able to produce anything. And so I agree, capitalism hasn't brainwashed us necessarily, but it has defined that working and being busy are not the same thing. Working is making sure that you're actually making progress towards a goal. Busy for the sake of business sake is just silly.
So that's the important thing, right? That you distinguish there at the end. Busy and working aren't the same thing. And so if anyone's been brainwashed into thinking busy means working, it's this person who's making that they're making that
Mm,
as though everyone else has assumed that, but that's not necessarily the case.
mm.
I think like what you highlight there is, if you're busy chasing that elk but you don't get anything for it, then that's not a good trade-off. That's not a capitalism. But no one has ever thought you couldn't be busy doing things that aren't work. This is just an absurd premise. I've had very busy vacations before, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't working during those vacations. I had a lot of activities. I was expending energy. But busy has a definition. Busy has a meaning. And here, this just uh, makes me think that this person is lobbing every bad thing they possibly can and throwing, paint on the picture of capitalism to try to say, oh, capitalism is responsible for every bad ruining thing. And it's like, no, for one, this person's making a joke about someone saying they have a very busy day and then they're sitting under a tree and eating a sandwich. That's a joke. I get it. And I get that this person's also trying to make a joke, but it's just a nonsensical joke because no one thinks that busy and working are identical terms. And I understand that there is an underlying assumption sometimes that like you feel like in order to be you shouldn't have leisure because you should be busy working or whatever. But those aren't the same thing. Those aren't the same terms. And it just irritates me to no end because we've had the concept of busyness and being busy and busy schedules long before capitalism was ever implemented in society. I mean, read like a letter from Martin Luther in a pre-capitalist age, and he says, "Sorry, I haven't written to you. I've been busy." Oh no! How did he get brainwashed into thinking that meant working? It's just so dumb. It's just so silly, and I just don't like that people keep doing this thing where they say, "Oh my goodness, every societal ill, every misapplication of a virtue or a value is the fault of capitalism." When one, as you highlighted, like being busy working is in and of itself a virtue, and it can be taken too far. There is value in rest. There is value in things that don't directly produce food. There are, like if I'm sitting and I'm sort of sorting myself out and understanding how to discipline myself and learning and thinking deeply about things, that has value. But we shouldn't automatically say that kind of value translates and is the only kind of value you need to create. As you highlighted earlier, if you're doing things like gaming 24/7, then you're not going to have food, and that's a very specific kind of value you need. Now, if you can create value by gaming and showing other people and entertaining them, and they're willing to give you food for that thing, that's great. You are producing a value of a sort, but it's entirely on you to convince other people that it's worth it. And like you said, that's not actually creating, the food. And so that kind of value of harvesting and producing and creating resources still needs to be done. I think that sometimes people don't recognize that value is subjective, but there's also unique attributes and unique kinds of values. So to say that, well, if me giving a speech, people pay me $5 to see that speech, and someone else like picks fruits and sells those fruits for $5, we've both created the same amount of value. That might be true, but there are unique attributes to each of those, right? My speech doesn't necessarily create anything or produce any resource, any material good that can help people sustain. Maybe you could argue that there are other benefits, like maybe it increases morale, maybe it helps people hold on and try a little longer, and that's all good and fine. But there is that's a unique property, just like producing something from the ground or growing an actual crop is producing a unique material, and that in and of itself is different than the kind of value. So even if you have equal value things in terms of subjective evaluations from people, you have to recognize there are unique attributes. All of this to say, this person sort of mocking the idea of, oh, you're not allowed to rest and be busy for 3 hours, resting. It's like, no, resting yourself and nourishing yourself and taking care of yourself, that is a good thing and it is a good value. But you also need to make sure that the unique values of doing things that are going to be productive and create more are also being taken care of. And that is the kind of busyness that is really good that capitalism allows to flourish.
I don't have any more to add. That was great.
Great. We'll move on to our next one here. And this comes from Michael Malice quote tweeting someone. So we'll start with the quote tweet and then read Michael Malice's response. So the first post reads, "I've studied term limits a fair bit, and I'd support a constitutional amendment to enact them. The fear I have is that term limits turn office staff and lobbyists into power brokers more than they already are. Although the system's so broke, I'm willing to give it a shot." Michael Malice tweets, "New York City has term limits. Obama would have beaten Trump in 2016 since he barely beat Hillary when it came to vote margins. It's not going to make a huge difference for the better. The politicians are often interchangeable. The system is the issue." What do you think of Malice's take here?
I think it's a great take. I like how he laid it out. I mean, the analogy I would use is that you've got an arm that is bleeding out from a gunshot wound, and someone is complaining about the size of bandage that you've put over it. That's what term limits are in a lot of ways to me. It's like, yeah, you're going to stop the bleeding a little bit better, but in reality, you got to remove the bullet from the wound at the end of the day. That's what's actually causing all of these issues. And like he's saying, the system is the actual issue. It's the fact that we have people that are elected through a popularity contest that are able to execute their will involuntarily over other people on the other side of the country that they don't even know, they've never met, they don't know any of their incentives, what they care about, what their families are like, or what their unique situations in their community might be. That is the system we currently live under. And it sounds insane when you actually break it down. But for whatever reason, because of the public school system, and this is just the way things have been, people come to accept it as that. And term limits sound nice, and it's correctly diagnosing. It's not even correctly diagnosing. It's in the ballpark of recognizing what the issue is. Is that there are people that have a say in our lives that should not have a say in our lives. That people stay in power for a long time. Like I remember, not remember, but just recently, Dianne Feinstein, who cannot really remember very well, just like her daughter is now her power of attorney because she doesn't have the mental faculties to actually manage her estate. Yet she is still able to be part of Congress and make votes and make laws for the people of California, as well as influence laws that affect you and I when we don't even live in her state. She's, I think, 90 or something years old and obviously has dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. So they correctly get that, hey, that's not good. But they don't realize it's even if we did away with those people being in power, you still have the administrative state in place. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how did the administrative state get there in the first place? Why do they have so much power? Well, it's because you've given politicians the incentive to keep those people in power because they don't want to have any of the decisions that those guys make on their record. They're willing to pass it off to them for them to do it. And so now, instead of us being ruled by one king like we were prior to 1776, we're ruled by dozens, millions, thousands, all these different types of kings in different areas of life that are just bureaucrats. So those people got into place because of politicians. It wouldn't actually change anything whether we have term limits or term limits or do not have term limits. The issue is the entire system and the incentive structure, and you will get to this same result no matter how you go about it. We just need to do away with that and make people appreciate liberty much more and take agency over their own outcomes in their own lives.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I think ultimately that is the conclusion I've come to as well, where I used to really support the idea. After reading Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, one of the things that he points out is that monarchies in many ways had, for their flaws, he does not argue that monarchy is a good system, but he points out that for the flaws they had, monarchies had something that democracies inherently do not, which is time preference. Because if you're a king and you know that your children are going to inherit the land that you're taking care of, the wealth of your country matters in the long term, not just in the short term. And so you are much more reticent to go to war because that means potentially sacrificing your economy. It means potentially sacrificing the lives of your men and your workers and paying out of your treasury and all that and leaving your country in worse shape. You're risking those things for your future progeny. It also means that you're less likely to harvest all of the crops into a massive feast for yourself and for your officials and leave nothing there for the peasants, because if those peasants are starved, then you have no workers. Now, again, I'm not saying that the monarchy system is set up well, but you can understand that time preference is something that term limits necessarily don't have, because you only maximum as president only can stay in 8 years. And let's be honest. How many presidents, when you look back objectively from your own your own subjective standards, but objective in your own mind by your own rubric, have done better in their second term than their first?
Even Thomas Jefferson didn't do better in his
Even
second.
Thomas Jefferson, absolutely, especially even Grover Cleveland. These examples of people who, when they are lame duck presidents or lame duck officers, they lose all kinds of long future planning need, and therefore they do things that benefit them in the now, in the short term, and so on the one hand, term limits create more situations where people don't have long time preference. Now, if you were to take that further and abolish all time limits, then I think you have what we currently are seeing in the current bureaucratic state, which is manipulations of systems to continually reward people in their own class. I would argue that now, more than kings and kingdoms did in historical times, we at least in the United States, we have a government so broad, so overreaching, so regulate, with such long tendrils of regulatory authority into the lives and the systems of America, that even if you have no term limits and you want to create sort of a future proof, like, you need the system to do well so that people inheriting things can do. Even we live in a system that's so entangled with regulations that they will artificially pump up the economy, and they will do things to segment the population so that even if half of the country's burning, the other half is doing well. And that's why I think you see a lot of people worried and complaining about things like the loss of the middle class and the greater wealth inequality and those types of things. And I don't think that those, overall, I'm happier if more people are getting lifted out of poverty. But wealth inequality is a real concern when you look at the trajectory of the country, because what it does mean is that the elites are trying to quickly aggregate as much money as they can, because I think they realize the whole system is going to collapse. And so even though there's no term limits, these systems have been built to scam regular people who aren't making deals with them. So they aren't big businesses that are paying off government officials, or they aren't government officials themselves. And those institutions and systems are being propped up. Again, you print out fake money when you need it. You devalue the currency for everyone else, but you keep getting the bank and the heyday. So to me, it's like you said, it's sort of danged if you do, danged if you don't. Term limits increase your short-term gain, your short-term, I'm going to burn the turf and take what I can. But long-term, no term limits. I think that the regulations are so ingrained in our society that if they're there for a long time and without any stops, they'll keep building more and more laws and rules that transfer the wealth from normal people to sort of the elites and the government workers anyway. So the system is really the problem here.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. I got to read that book by Hoffa, because I hear it mentioned quite a bit. And one of our favorites, Dave Smith, always talks about this, how, at face value, if you were living in the early 1900s and you looked at what was Russia, which later became the Soviet Union, you're like, oh, well, the populists are rising up and taking out the kings and the queens and the czar and all these guys out of power and stuff. It's like, oh, yeah, it was really bad under them. But it's like, what then, went forth after that? It was like, oh, yeah, it was Stalin's Soviet Union with millions of people dying of starvation and death and murder and all these things that were awful. So it's like, it's not immediately clear that when you get rid of a monarch or you get rid of term limits or whatever, that things are going to be, it's a given that it's going to be better. And it's like, there's an underlying principle that is being violated in each of these systems that inevitably leads to the conclusion of theft and murder and war crimes and overall suffering and poverty. And it's not because we don't have term limits or that there's a king or anything. It's that we have someone executing their power over other people involuntarily. At least within democracy, I guess, like, you have the illusion of that it's, that it's voluntary because we choose, right? But the problem is that it's 51% of the population choosing for the other 49% of the population. So you still have that aspect. It's just a few steps removed.
Yep, that's exactly right. Okay, our next post comes from the Libertarian Party and then a reply to that. So the Libertarian Party tweets out, "Today is the anniversary of the atomic bomb detonation in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It's a sad reminder that most of what we have been taught about the atomic bombs and the reasons behind their usage is the product of lies and the US propaganda machine." And then there's a reply that reads, "Personally, the Japs deserved it for what they did in Nanking Unit 731 and what they did to prisoners of war." What do you make of that take?
It's it's a terrible take. I mean, I think I saw someone reply to this that like, well, so did we deserve what happened to us on 9/11? You know, when Bin Laden's group went and slammed the planes into our towers because we had been expanding military bases all over the Middle East and killing their children through starvation and blockade. It's like, of course not. Just because evil people in a government and evil people within one portion of a society decide to do one thing doesn't mean that you have the right to suddenly go kill, 250,000 innocent women and children and men, innocent men, women, and children. They're all potentially innocent, or a good faction of them are, right? It was not military forces that were being bombed here. I still argue that it wouldn't be good if we did that as well, but it's not like they were any present, clear and present danger to the United States, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you add on to the fact, it's like he uses the example of Nanking, which was awful. I'm not really familiar with Unit 731, and I am somewhat familiar with the prisoners of war aspect. But it's like, yeah, those were all perpetrated by soldiers, and we also perpetrated similar awful things within our history. That does not, I mean, if someone decided they were going to drop, the Fat Man on Seattle, I mean, we would all be like horrified at that. It's like, well, we had nothing to do, with whatever we were doing over in the Middle East. I mean, maybe we voted for some of it, and maybe we, didn't fight some of the powers that be enough to, stop them from doing that. But we would still say, hey, that's still wrong. You shouldn't kill innocent people over what their evil government decides to do. Then you add on to this, right, that most of the major generals of the day said we probably could have beaten Japan. We probably would have had Japan's unconditional surrender, and they had already offered it without having to use these atomic bombs on these civilians. But the fact of the matter is that the military-industrial complex, the one that Dwight D. Eisenhower talked about when he was president, was really interested in seeing what these bombs could do in an actual, civilian area. And so that's why we chose the places that we chose to bomb. And we wanted to just see what it would do. And it's awful that we had to kill, 250,000 people for that science experiment to be played out. But it really speaks to the evil of our higher ups, and that there were no good guys in World War II, despite what the history books will tell us.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's so many aspects of this that are evil the more you look into it. If it was as simplistic as many people assume it is based on what we are taught, then maybe you might have some level of argument. But when you look at the actual specifics of what occurred, it's pretty inexcusable. So even the history of Pearl Harbor aside, which I think I've already ranted about, but Pearl Harbor was very clearly provoked and
Allowed.
asked for. Yeah, I mean, not even allowed so much as intentionally sought after by FDR. But that aside, you even look at the specifics, and the bombers who dropped on both Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they were told to target the centers of those cities. Now, there were military and industrial plants in those cities. That's why they were allegedly chosen. However, most of those plants and factories were on the outskirts of the cities, and they were directly told to bomb the centers where it would have the most impact on civilians and things like that. And so that alone shows you that this was not a bomb dropped in self-defense only, and we just got to end this as quickly as possible. And even if that is the case, we have to recognize that is retaliation politics, as the second take sort of implies, is a good thing. Retaliation is not just. There is no justice in that. in taking, the agony of thousands of innocent civilians for what the government has done. I mean, people who tend to defend this, I would say a lot of the time, are conservative, and it's like, how would they feel if, because the IRS, unfairly targeted Tea Party people, a bunch of Tea Party, officials, or maybe a bunch of Republican politicians sued them into the ground as justification? Well, you pay taxes to the IRS, and the IRS unfairly targeted us. I mean, there's no level of justice in which that makes sense. And it's just kind of an absurd notion to think. And that's what you have going on here, except on a much more horrific scale, because this, of course, involves the loss of human life in not only the loss of human life, but loss of human life in a most aggravating and awful manner. And so it's just frustrating to see people say, "Oh, well, they deserved it," as though that's a justification, when it's like, the citizens had nothing to do with it. The citizens were directly targeted, and so there's no justice, and there's no level of, this was done purely as a strategic move. If it was done out of revenge, that's not how we should have policy.
Yep.
If it is done out of revenge, it also wasn't done well out of revenge. It's not cool for me to shoot a neighbor because I'm mad at being robbed and they weren't robbed. I mean, there's almost no connection to bombing the Japanese citizens. The only defense they often will give is, well, they would have had to mobilize for a land invasion, which, one, didn't happen yet. We don't punish people for things that didn't happen. And two, we don't even know that that's true, especially considering there were terms to offer surrender that the U.S. had rejected and turned down.
Yeah, and that's where I'd like to take it a little further, is that what I learned in my history books, even in good old homeschool, is that the use of the atomic bombs were necessary because a land invasion of Japan would have killed a lot more people, millions of people potentially. And so therefore it was a mercy for us to drop these bombs on people, innocent women and children. But the fact of the matter is that, and I believe that the Libertarian Party's tweet also kind of illuminates a little bit more of this, if you want to go read it. But we had actually been receiving overtures from the Japanese that, hey, we might be okay with surrendering. We might be open to it. But because Japan is an honor-based culture, there was going to need to be a little bit of symbolic saving of face between some provisions for the emperor and various generals and whatnot. I think that we could have probably granted some of those conditions in exchange for not killing 250,000 people. On top of that, all of the top generals, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but they all thought it was unnecessary. From Dwight Eisenhower to Douglas MacArthur to some of the top admirals, they all said, hey, we had been blockading Japan. They had basically stopped all of their naval operations a few months before this even occurred. And they were running out of fuel, running out of food, and running out of resources. It was only a matter of time until it was just a logistical necessity for them to surrender, and their unconditional surrender. So all of these generals, the people that are most responsible for the people that we would be sending in, hypothetically, in a land invasion, they all agreed that we didn't need to drop these bombs. So when you read these history books and they say that, just read it and know that there's another side of the story, and the side of the story is told by the generals that were actually putting their own soldiers on the line potentially for it.
That's exactly right. Well, and one of the concessions that they really wanted was to retain their emperor for that. And guess what? One of the conditions that we agreed to after we bombed them was, oh yeah, you can keep your emperor, even though that was a big sticking point for us. You can't keep your emperor after this, and then we let them do it anyway. So it really was not an actual condition. It seemed like this was more done out of a spite and retaliation than actual military tactical strategy. Okay, next we've got a take from Mike Pence, who tweets, today's indictment serves as an important reminder. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. What do you think? Are you a big constitutionalist these days?
Well, I mean, you and I think would probably both agree that the Constitution is a piece of paper that affirms rights that are self-evident, that have already been granted to us by our Creator, that cannot be taken away regardless of whether that piece of paper was burned up or not. So like I like the Constitution in as much as that is honored by the people that live under it, hypothetically. But like, it's, to me, what's really annoying about this take and what I think is so bad about it is that name a politician in the past 200 and whatever amount of years that has never put himself above the Constitution.
Yeah.
much less any sort of president, right? Like,
Right.
it's like basically I when people ask me like what my political opinions are, I'm like, oh yeah, like I think that Donald Trump should probably be in jail for war crimes for life. And I also think that should be Biden and Obama and W. Bush and Clinton and H.W. Bush and Reagan and so on and so forth, basically all the way back to maybe Calvin Coolidge, maybe Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then basically all the way back to the founding fathers, essentially. So all of these guys have done things that totally shred the Constitution. The only way that we get to the current state of where it's all shredded up and everyone's like, we don't even honor, is because every other president beforehand has violated and pressed the envelope more and more and more with their executive orders, with their establishment of wars without the approval of Congress, by, signing into law, like things like the Patriot Act. They are not vanguards and protectors of this Constitution. If anything, they are actually the interested parties in destroying it, because destroying it means they have more power. And so it's just kind of like, it's like, of all the things to be like, oh, you shouldn't be president because you put yourself over the Constitution, is it really going to be him questioning whether or not, the votes were tallied were correct and maybe getting a little bit angry about it? Like, of all the things that you're going to get upset about, it's going to be that. It's not all the different wars. It's not all the different things that he did, with enforcing the embargo on Yemen, as well as supplying the Saudis in Yemen and their genocide. It's not, Obama with his Obamacare, if you want to just make it economical without putting lives on the line. It's like all of these things they go above and beyond the Constitution. It's totally trampled on, but it's only when it's politically expedient does Mike Pence now suddenly care about it. And I think that really speaks to the entire morality of the Republican Party. They say they like the Constitution, that we need to protect it, that we need to honor it, and all these things. But the second it becomes politically expedient to do away with it, they do it. And it happens to be very politically expedient very much a lot of the time for them to do away with it. And the only time that you ever catch them wanting to honor is when it's a politically expedient for them to do so as well. It's almost like the only moral principle that undergirds them is political expediency, not any sort of actual principle.
Oh yeah. I mean, think about how ridiculous it is if you're anyone who's been paying attention to think that an indictment like this is an important reminder of anything other than the fact that people are political opportunists. This is such a stupid take, because it assumes, of course, that the justice system is this unbiased, and he's like citing it like, well, look, I guess today's indictment's a reminder about this, guys. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, you mentioned, we don't love Trump here, but Trump was framed by the Justice Department from day one. He was tried to be set up in so many different ways.
And Mike Pence supported that, like, in terms of like, it was like, oh yeah, they're framing us. Like,
yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. He's not even been consistently on the side of these people until, again, it's like, oh well, I guess I can take a shot here at my brand. And so it's just a stupid thing that, it's like the crooked judge rules in favor of the rich guy, and then the rich guy goes, what do you know? I guess justice really prevails today. Like, that doesn't mean anything when you paid him off behind the scenes. And so this that to me just makes me laugh, like, as if he's appealing to this unbiased third party when we all know that it's just a terrible source to cite to begin with. But like you said, of all things for Trump to be got on, this to me seems like the worst. And the thing is that's frustrating about it is that, if you're someone who doesn't want to see Donald Trump reelected again at any cost, then having people like Mike Pence say these things is actually wonderful for you. Because what I think it does is I think it really, really aggravates his base. And so then they become very belligerent to anyone else. They become locked down. And then you end up giving Donald Trump a unique demographic of votes in the primary who will never budge and never compromise. And so you really, when Mike Pence is tweeting this, he's really solidifying Trump winning this primary in many ways. And that's great for anyone who doesn't want to see Donald Trump as president or a Republican as president, because I don't think Donald Trump will win an election with this. Like, there's kind of this common thought about, oh, this indictment's really going to rally his base and make him win. But I think all it does is it rallies the very, very into Trump people, the very extreme people who like him. And that's about it. And when you take that to a general election, I don't think it translates very well. You can look at election results from 2020, from 2022, when there were similar kinds of things that everyone predicted would cause, red sweeps in judicial elections and special elections, and they just didn't pan out that way. So it's really silly to me for Mike Pence of all people, unless he really doesn't care about his own candidacy, which I don't believe. I actually do believe Mike Pence really, really cares about his own candidacy.
Yes.
So it's really silly for him to be taking this stand and to be doing this, because all it's going to do is make his, Donald Trump fans really rallied and make sure that he gets that nomination. So I think it's just a strategically stupid position to take, as well as just a philosophically stupid one to take.
Well, it makes you realize how out of touch these people are.
Yeah.
Like it never ceases to amaze me. Most of the time with the Republicans, I think the Democrat candidates, they're not fantastic or even good at it, but they're better in being in touch with what their base wants and parroting that stuff. But Republican candidates have no idea, especially after Trump. They have no idea what actually resonates. And so they will say these things. And I genuinely think that Mike Pence thinks this is like what resonates with his people. Like, well, if I use the words, Constitution and you should never put yourself over this, then like, oh, all the conservatives are going to come out for me. It's like, no, like you've totally missed the plot here. Conservatives, voters at least, are no longer, they realize what game is being played, and they like the guy that punches back, that is going to go to war for them and actually plays dirty. I mean, in a lot of ways, people like, I love fighting, so I just love talking about that, but like people love this fighter named Nate Diaz, not because he's technically perfect, and he is really good on certain things, but because he's willing to brawl, and he's willing to make fun of people in the ring when things aren't going his way, and then sometimes squeak out a win that way by trash talking. People love that about him. People love that about Donald Trump, because not only is it entertaining to watch, but he's also sticking it to the people that have looked down and sneered on people for forever. Mike Pence and a lot of the other Republican guys, like, they don't understand this. And the fact that like he can make a blunder this big and be this so far off from like what his constituency hypothetically wants should make you question whether we should be voting about having these people in power anywhere ever at any point in time.
Yeah, I think you're right. The lack of connection really shows that people don't, or at least these people on the top don't realize to the extent to which I think the Republican Party has become Trump's party, not the party of the Constitution, not the party, and like they ever were, right? The Constitution was a great icon for them until something that actually had punch came around, right? If the Constitution had been actually restraining politicians, then maybe the Constitution would be this rallying symbol for people. But when it comes down to it, they felt, rightly or wrongly, that Donald Trump was really the only one standing up for them, and really the only one who was actually pushing back and restraining people and cutting red tape. And, I don't think that that's necessarily the most accurate example of what really happened, but it does at least have more resonance than this idea of the Constitution. So, yeah,
the Constitution thing was always interesting to me, like pre-Donald Trump, because the argument that people would come back with, like, well, we this isn't in our Constitution, and then someone that wants to violate will say, well, it needs to be a living, breathing document. It needs to change with the times. That's a really good argument to be made if you're saying that, like, we need to obey this piece of paper. It's like, yeah, why should we obey a piece of paper that was written 200 years ago? You can't make an argument for obeying that piece of paper simply because it was written 200 years ago by our founding. Like, you have to actually make a logical, coherent, principle-based argument to adhere to that the principles laid out there scale to today, and they continue on. But the Republicans will never do that, because at the end of the day, these guys that are in power, like, they don't actually have any principles that undergird themselves. If they had been living according to principles like staying married to the same woman, not cheating, not using the surveillance state when it suited them, not going and drumming up patriotism so they could enrich their buddies in the military-industrial complex, like, all of these short failings and hypocrisy has been laid out, and so they actually have no argument to make about obeying the Constitution other than that it is a piece of paper. Because if they did make it from a principle standpoint, like, they would get nailed on hypocrisy right away. Trump just said, I am a hypocrite. I do what I want, and I'm going to win. You're going to be tired of winning. And, like, as dumb as that argument is, like, you and I would think of it as an argument, it's actually a better argument than the one that the current Republicans are making. That's not saying much, but it's a better one, and that's why people resonate with Trump, and why the Republican Party has become the party of Trump now.
I think that's absolutely right. All right, our last take today. This one really is good. It reads, I think parents should be able to tell teachers what to teach. I also think random civilians who have played Call of Duty should be in charge of small unit infantry tactics, and anyone with a YouTube account should be able to direct surgeries. Oh, and I've played Top Gun on NES, so I should be able to tell airplane pilots how to fly planes. What do you think? Is this the masterful comparison that they think it is?
No, this is a terrible, terrible take. I don't. Just because, like, it's like a false equivalency, I would say. Like, it's kind of a weird false equivalency fallacy here, in that in terms of grade school, from grades K through 12, most parents are suitable and have the ability to teach those topics. Maybe once you get into like some of the chemistry and some of the more hard sciences at the upper levels, like, yeah, maybe you then don't have as much you don't have as much experience or qualification to teach those things. But in terms of math and stuff, like my mother does not have a teaching degree; she has a business degree. And she was able to teach us pretty adequately until about 7th grade. And then I went into co-ops with college professors who then taught me. And I realized I was actually over-prepared by my mother's teaching for that. And I didn't go to school and sit in a classroom for 8 hours a day. I actually did about an hour of school a day. I just did my homework. And then we had one day where my mom would, do 5 hours of like lecturing to us about different types of topics and things like that. So the ability, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but flying a plane is a much harder thing with a higher skill set and a bigger drop off in terms of what constitutes that you can fly a plane versus not fly a plane versus what it means to teach 2 + 2 = 4. The public school system doesn't even really do that well anymore, which is kind of crazy. But parents are able to see when their kid comes home, because hypothetically, right, they were raised in this public school system, so they should know what the right answer is. And it's like, okay, well, if their kids aren't learning this, and they're the ones that have the experience with and the most vested interest in their kids knowing, it's like, yeah, the skill sophistication curve is not the same. So it's perfectly fine for parents to say, hey, I want my student to learn this, and I don't want them to have to learn that. It is not the same thing as me having played. I mean, I guess you could play Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's actually used as a way to teach people to fly. But me playing Top Gun on NES and being able to tell a pilot to do a plane, I could not actually hop in a plane after playing Top Gun and know how to fly it. A parent can have not ever been a teacher and can know whether or not their kid is learning math and English and all these other things. As a fellow homeschooler, I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the complete mischaracterization here is the idea that as a parent, you do not get to decide what your kids taught. And the problem there is, like, when we talk about things like a small infantry tactics, directing surgeries, or flying a plane, there's a very specific, this is what it was need to be known to be able to do X, Y, and Z. The problem with human beings is that there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to how do you become a good human and how do you become a functioning member of society. And unlike people who, run airlines, or people who direct or perform surgeries, or run hospitals, there isn't the guide of what is or isn't acceptable. And I think that that's why parents have the sole discretion as to how to raise a child, because they have to say, this is what's important to learn, both in character and in substance. This is how you get prepared for life, both in terms of how to respond to things, what to value, as well as how to engage with the world. And most people recognize that part of that means getting educated in things like English and mathematics. But it's not like, the problem is we have this preconceived notion that you have to have an understanding of how a person develops in this like factory setting. Like, you go to school, you learn reading and writing in this specific way through these specific ages. It's like, that's not how the real world works. What actually should be done is evaluating what is going to help this person succeed and thrive and live life in a good, productive way. And again, most of the time, parents recognize that means going through an education that includes a lot of those facets. But the problem is we have this public education system that has now trained us to think so binary. We have to think that it's you either go to school or you are dumb outclassed. Like, that's not even an option. It's like there are many people who would do so far better with, trade vocation type trainings than a lot of the required, English class. Now, I love English. I think English is a great skill set, and I think people should know that. But there are people who don't need to know that. And I think that the only people who should be able to determine that are parents and themselves when they're old enough to make those decisions about what they do and don't want to learn. And so, with that as the sort of preconceived notion, is that like parents don't have this idea of what they should or shouldn't be teaching their kids, then yeah, I guess this would make sense if you think that like there's the state or some other random entity has this formula of what does or doesn't matter. But that's not how human beings work. And even if it was how human beings worked, the state, the educational system, this random person making this post, they don't actually own your kids. They don't get to make that manual and design how those things get implemented. And so I think that that's the biggest thing here is, to me, it's like you need to understand the application of priorities, the application of ownership of children and of people. Like, you don't own my kids, and the education system isn't a binary like model citizen comes out when you do these inputs. It's like life is way more complicated than that, and that's why parents who know kids should have the most control over how their kids are interacting and learning in life.
This is also just the biggest like appeal to authority like fallacy as well. Like, if you just take the first one, like what he's inferring that, well, teachers are the experts, therefore they should say what you should teach. Well, then how would you ever go about determining whether a teaching program is good or not, right? Or is effective in right. Whether it even has the right goals at the end of the day. And I think about like when I was remodeling a house, like I am not a plumber. I have a little bit of cursory knowledge on it because I worked in HVAC. I'm also only remodeled a handful of bathrooms in my life. But I got a bid for a shower for someone to do a shower, and they wanted to charge me $30,000 to do it without doing any of the plumbing. They're like, well, we're just going to come in and do this. And it's like, well, when I think through this, $30,000 seems really steep to just put in some ceramic surrounding and then hook up some piping. That I'm going to do my own research. I'm going to go out and see what other bids there are going to be doing. That does not mean I went to like Reddit or somewhere and only looked at what they were saying and said, oh yeah, like if you buy this magical box, you'll be able to make a shower. It's like, no. Like, I went and got other bids from other experts. I also went and, did some Googling on, actual like how you would install a shower yourself if you wanted to. And it's like, okay, now I know what's involved. And if I can kind of reverse engineer this $30,000 bid and be like, okay, yeah, they're literally trying to charge me a year's worth of work for someone to come do this, this job, which should really take about a day and a half. All that like logical fact finding, all of that research and in-depth, like I'm going to logic why this bid is so high and whether it actually is fair or not. That is doing my own research. It is not me just saying, well, they're the plumbers, so they must know, so it must be $30,000, for me to install the shower. Like, we all do that in all other areas of our lives, but it's only when it comes to some of these sacred cows of the regime, the public school system and public teachers, and particularly, the medical industry, that we're suddenly like, oh, no, we got to just listen to them. Well, who's going to keep them in check? How there have been failing standards in the public school system since we instituted the Board of Education, Department of Education, excuse me, in 1970. Like, they have failed every single metric that they grade themselves on. So who's to say that they are actually the experts, right? They can't even pass their own tests of themselves. So at the end of the day, it's like, you have to actually make a logical argument for why teachers should or should not be teaching certain things. If a teacher can't even justify it for themselves, and you resort to saying, well, I'm the teacher, so I say so. It's like, well, that isn't going to work for an adult. It might work on a kid, but it doesn't work on adults. And it really shows you what they think of the general populace. Like, they kind of make everyone seem like they're infants, incapable of their own decision making. It's like, no, we just want you to fall in line and listen to what we're saying, and then make your kids also listen to what we're saying. I'd highly encourage anyone to not do that and homeschool your kids, or find an amazing co-op or private school instead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It really is that ownership claim that they feel like they have. And the last thing I'll say, which isn't really a point, it is just kind of funny. All four of the appeals here to authority are all super, super heavily regulated government industries.
Yes.
Right? You have teachers teaching, you have Call of Duty for the military, you have, the healthcare system, and then you have the airlines, all of which have been like bailed out by government. So yeah, this person really is a is a shill for government authority. Oh man. Well, anyway, that's our episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave us a like, comment if you think any of our takes here on these takes are wrong. Send us any takes you want us to critique, and we'll catch you on the next one.